Chapter 4. Sumer, Land of the Gods. There is no doubt that the, quote, olden words, end quote, which for thousands of years constituted the language of the higher learning and religious scriptures, was the language of Sumer. There is also no doubt that the, quote, olden gods, end quote, were the gods of Sumer. Records and tales and genealogies and histories of gods older than those pertaining to the gods of Sumer have not been found anywhere. When these gods, in their original Sumerian forms or in later Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian, are named and counted, the list runs into the hundreds. But once they are classified, it is clear that they were not a hodgepodge of divinities. They were headed by a pantheon of great gods, governed by an assembly of the deities and related to each other. Once the numerous lesser nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and the like are excluded, a much smaller and coherent group of deities emerges, each with a role to play, each with certain powers or responsibilities. There were, the Sumerians believed, gods that were, quote, of the heavens, end quote. Texts dealing with the time, quote, before things were created, end quote, talk of such heavenly gods as Apsu, Tiamat, Enchar, Kishar. No claim is ever made that the gods of this category ever appeared upon earth. As we look closer at these, quote, gods, end quote, who existed before earth was created, we shall realize that they were the celestial bodies that make up our solar system, and, as we shall show, the so-called Sumerian myths regarding these celestial beings are, in fact, precise and scientifically plausible cosmologic concepts regarding the creation of our solar system. There were also lesser gods who were, quote, of earth, end quote. Their cult centers were mostly provincial towns. They were no more than local deities. At best, they were given charge of some limited operation, as, for example, the goddess Ninkashi, or, quote, Lady Beer, end quote, who supervised the preparation of beverages. Of them, no heroic tales were told. They possessed no awesome weapons, and the other gods did not shudder at their command. They remind one very much of the company of young gods that marched last in procession depicted on the rocks of Hittite Yazalakaya. Between the two groups there were the gods of heaven and earth, the ones called, quote, the ancient gods, end quote. They were the, quote, olden gods, end quote, of the epic tales, and, in the Sumerian belief, they had come down to earth from the heavens. These were no mere local deities. They were the national gods, indeed international gods. Some of them were present and active upon earth even before there were men upon earth. Indeed, the very existence of man was deemed to have been the result of a deliberate creative enterprise of the part of these gods. They were powerful, capable of feats beyond mortal ability or comprehension. Yet these gods not only looked like humans, but ate and drank like them and displayed virtually every human emotion of love and hate, loyalty and infidelity. Although the roles and hierarchical standing of some of the principal deities shifted over the millennia, a number of them never lost their paramount position and their national and international veneration. As we take a close look at this central group, there emerges a picture of a dynasty of gods, a divine family, closely related yet bitterly divided. The head of this family of gods of heaven and earth was An, or Anu in the Babylonian Assyrian text. He was the great father of the gods, the king of the gods. His realm was the expanse of the heavens, and his symbol was a star. In the Sumerian pictographic writing, the sign of the star also stood for An, for, quote, heavens, end quote, and for, quote, divine being, end quote, or, quote, God, end quote, or descended of An. This fourfold meaning of the symbol remained through the ages as the script moved from the Sumerian pictographic to the cuneiform Akkadian, to the stylized Babylonian and Assyrian. From the very earliest times until the cuneiform script faded away, from the 4th millennium BC almost to the time of Christ, the symbol preceded the names of the gods, indicating that the name written in the text was not of a mortal, but of a deity of heavenly origin. Anu's abode, and the seat of his kingship, was in the heavens. That was where the other gods of heaven and earth went when they needed individual advice or favor, or where they met in assembly to settle disputes among themselves or to reach major decisions. Numerous texts describe Anu's palace, whose portals were guarded by a god of the tree of truth and a god of the tree of life, his throne, the manner in which other gods approached him, and how they sat in his presence. The Sumerian texts could also recall instances when not only the other gods, but even some chosen mortals were permitted to go up to Anu's abode, mostly with the object of escaping mortality. One such tale pertained to Adapa, of, quote, model of man, end quote. He was so perfect and so loyal to the god Ea, who had created him, that Ea arranged for him to be taken to Anu. He had then described to Adapa what to expect. Adapa, thou art going before Anu, the king. The road to heaven thou wilt take. When to heaven thou ascended, and hast approached the gate of Anu, the, quote, bearer of life, end quote, and the, quote, grower of truth, end quote, at the gate of Anu will be standing. Guided by his creator, Adapa, quote, to heaven went up, ascended to heaven and approached the gate of Anu, end quote. But when he was offered a chance to become immortal, Adapa refused to eat the bread of life, thinking that the angry Anu offered him poisoned food. He was thus returned to earth as an anointed priest, but still immortal. The Sumerian claimed that not only gods, but also selected mortals could ascend to the divine abode in the heavens, as echoed in the Old Testament tales of the ascent to the heavens by Enoch and the prophet Elijah. Though Anu lived in a heavenly abode, the Sumerian texts reported instances when he came down to earth, either at times of great crisis or on ceremonial visits, when he was accompanied by his spouse Antu, or, at least once, to make his great-granddaughter, Inanna, his consort on earth. Since he did not permanently reside on earth, there was apparently no need to grant him exclusivity over his own city or cult center, and the abode, or, quote, high house, end quote, erected for him was located at Uruk, the biblical Erech, the domain of the goddess Inanna. The ruins of Uruk include to this day a huge man-made mound where archaeologists have found evidence of the construction and reconstruction of a high temple, the Temple of Anu. No less than 18 strata or distinct phases were discovered there, indicating the existence of compelling reasons to maintain the temple at the sacred site. The Temple of Anu was called Eanna, or, quote, House of An, end quote, but this simple name applied to a structure that, at least at some of its phases, was quite a sight to behold. It was, according to Sumerian texts, quote, the hallowed Eanna, the pure sanctuary, end quote. Traditions maintain that the great gods themselves, quote, had fashioned its parts, end quote. Quote, its cornice was like copper, end quote. Quote, its great wall touching the clouds, a lofty dwelling place, end quote. Quote, it was the house whose charm was irresistible, whose allure was unending, end quote. And the text also made clear the temple's purpose, for they called it, quote, the house for descending from heaven, end quote. A tablet that belonged to an archive at Uruk enlightens us to the pomp and pageantry that accompanied the arrival of Anu and his spouse on a, quote, state visit, end quote. Because of damage to the tablet, we can read of the ceremonies only from some midpoint, when Anu and Antu were already seated in the temple's courtyard. The gods, quote, exactly in the same order as before, end quote, then formed a procession ahead of and behind the bearer of the scepter. The protocol then instructed, they shall then descend to the exalted court, and shall turn towards the god Anu. The priest of purification shall libate the scepter, and the scepter bearer shall enter and be seated. The deities, Papsakal, Nuska, and Shalah, shall then be seated in the court of the god of Anu. Meanwhile, the goddesses, quote, the divine offspring of Anu, Uruk's divine daughters, end quote, bore a second object, whose name or purpose are unclear, to the Enir, quote, the house of the golden bed of the goddess Antu, end quote. Then they returned in a procession to the courtyard, to the place where Antu was seated. While the evening meal was being prepared according to a strict ritual, a special priest smeared a mixture of, quote, good oil, end quote, and wine on the door sockets of the sanctuary to which Anu and Antu were later to retire for the night. A thoughtful touch intended, it seems, to eliminate squeaking of the doors while the two deities slept. While an, quote, evening meal, end quote, various drinks and appetizers, was being served, an astronomer priest went up to the, quote, topmost stage of the tower of the main temple, end quote, to observe the skies. He was to look out for the rising in a specific part of the sky of the planet named Great Anu of Heaven. Thereupon, he was to recite the compositions named, quote, to the one who grows bright, the heavenly planet of the Lord Anu, end quote, and, quote, the Creator's image has risen, end quote. Once the planet had been sighted and the poems recited, Anu and Antu washed their hands with water out of the golden basin, and the first part of the feast began. Then the 7 great gods also washed their hands from 7 large golden trays, and the second part of the feast began. The, quote, rite of washing of the mouth, end quote, was then performed. The priest recited the hymn, quote, the planet of Anu is heaven's hero, end quote. Torches were lit, and the gods, priests, singers, and food bearers arranged themselves in a procession, accompanying the 2 visitors to their sanctuary for the night. 4 major deities were assigned to remain in the courtyard and keep watch until daybreak. Others were stationed at various designated gates. Meanwhile, the whole country was to light up and celebrate the presence of the 2 divine visitors. On a signal from the main temple, the priests of all the other temples of Uruk were, quote, to use torches to start bonfires, end quote, and the priests in other cities, seeing the bonfires at Uruk, were to do the likewise. Then, the people of the land shall light fires in their homes, and shall offer banquets to all the gods. The guards of the cities shall light fires, in the streets and in the squares. The departure of the 2 great gods was also planned, not only to the day, but to the minute. On the 17th day, 40 minutes after sunrise, the gates shall be opened before the gods Anu and Antu, bringing to an end their overnight stay. While the end of this tablet is broken off, another text in all probability describes the departure, the morning meal, the incantations, the handshakes, or, quote, grasping of the hands, end quote, by the other gods. The great gods were then carried to their point of departure on throne-like litters carried on the shoulders of temple functionaries. An Assyrian depiction of a process of deities, though from a much later time, probably gives us a good idea of the manner in which Anu and Antu were carried during their procession in Uruk. Special incantations were recited when the procession was passing through, quote, the street of the gods, end quote. Other psalms and hymns were sung as the procession neared, quote, the holy key, end quote, and when it reached, quote, the dike of the ship of Anu, quote. Goodbyes were then said, and yet more incantations were recited and sung, quote, with hand-raising gestures, end quote. Then all the priests and temple functionaries who carried the gods, led by the great priest, offered a special, quote, prayer of departure, end quote. Quote, great Anu, may heaven and earth bless you, end quote, they intoned 7 times. They prayed for the blessing of the 7 celestial gods and invoked the gods that were in heaven and the gods that were upon earth. In conclusion, they bade farewell to Anu and Antu, thus, may the gods of the deep and the gods of the divine abode bless you. May they bless you daily, every day of every month of every year. Among the thousands upon thousands of depictions of the ancient gods that have been uncovered, none seems to depict Anu. Yet he peers at us from every statue and every portrait of every king that ever was, from antiquity to our very own days. For Anu was not only the great king, king of the gods, but also the one whose grace others could be crowned as kings. By Sumerian tradition, rulership flowed from Anu, and the very term for, quote, kingship, end quote, was Anutu, or, quote, Anu-ship, end quote. The insignia of Anu were the tiara, or divine headdress, the scepter, or symbol of power, and the staff, or symbolizing the guidance provided by the shepherd. The shepherd's staff may now be found more in the hands of bishops than of kings, but the crown and scepter are still held by whatever kings mankind has left on some thrones. The second most powerful deity of the Sumerian pantheon was Enlil. His name meant, quote, Lord of the airspace, end quote. The prototype and father of the later storm gods that were to head the pantheons of the ancient world. He was Anu's eldest son, born at his father's heavenly abode. But at some point in the earliest times he descended to earth, and was thus the principal god of heaven and earth. When the gods met in assembly at the heavenly abode, Enlil presided over the meetings alongside his father. When the gods met for assembly on earth, they met at Enlil's court in the divine precinct at Nibiru, the city dedicated to Enlil and the site of his main temple, the Iker, or, quote, house which is like a mountain, end quote. Not only the Sumerians, but the very gods of Sumer considered Enlil supreme. They called him ruler of all the lands, and made it clear that, quote, in heaven, he is the prince. On earth, he is the chief, end quote. His, quote, word, or command, high above made the heavens tremble, down below made the earth quake, end quote. Enlil, whose command is far-reaching, whose, quote, word, end quote, is lofty and holy, whose pronouncement is unchangeable, who decrees destinies unto the distant future. The gods of earth bow down willingly before him. The heavenly gods who are on earth humble themselves before him. They stand by faithfully according to instructions. Enlil, according to Sumerian beliefs, arrived on earth well before earth became settled and civilized. A, quote, hymn to Enlil, the all-beneficent, end quote, recounts the many aspects of society and civilization that would not have existed had it not been for Enlil's instructions to, quote, execute his orders far and wide, end quote. No cities would be built, no settlements founded. No stalls would be built, no sheepfolds erected. No king would be raised, no high priest born. The Sumerian text also stated that Enlil arrived on earth before the, quote, black-headed people, end quote, the Sumerian nickname for mankind, were created. During such pre-mankind times, Enlil erected Nibiru as his center, or, quote, command post, end quote, at which heaven and earth were connected through some, quote, bond, end quote. The Sumerian text called this bond Duranki, or, quote, bond heaven-earth, end quote, and used poetic language to describe Enlil's first actions on earth. Enlil, when you marked off divine settlements on earth, Nibiru you set up as your very own city, the city of earth, the lofty, your pure place whose water is sweet. You founded the Duranki, in the center of the four corners of the world. In those early days, when gods alone inhabited Nibiru and man had not yet been created, Enlil met the goddess who was to become his wife. According to one version, Enlil saw his future bride while she was bathing in Nibiru's stream, naked. It was love at first sight, but not necessarily with marriage in mind. The shepherd Enlil, who decrees the fates, the bright-eyed one, saw her. The Lord speaks to her of intercourse. She is unwilling. Enlil speaks to her of intercourse. She is unwilling. Quote, my vagina is too small, she said. It knows no copulation. My lips are too little. They know not kissing." End quote. But Enlil did not take no for an answer. He disclosed to his chamberlain Nushku his burning desire for, quote, "the young maid," end quote, who was called Sud, or, quote, "the nurse," end quote, and who lived with her mother at Eresh, or, quote, "scented house," end quote. Nushku suggested a boat ride and brought up a boat. Enlil persuaded Sud to go sailing with him. Once they were in the boat, he raped her. The ancient tale then relates that though Enlil was chief of the gods, they were so enraged that they seized him and banished him to the lower world. Quote, "Enlil, immoral one," end quote, they shouted at him. Quote, "Get thyself out of the city," end quote. This version has it that Sud, pregnant with Enlil's child, followed him and he married her. Another version has the repentant Enlil searching for the girl and sending his chamberlain to her mother to ask for the girl's hand. One way or another, Sud did become the wife of Enlil, and he bestowed on her the title Ninlil, or, quote, "Lady of the Airspace," end quote. But little did he and the gods who banished him know that it was not Enlil who had seduced Ninlil, but the other way around. The truth of the matter was that Ninlil bathed naked in the stream on her mother's instructions, with the hope that Enlil, who customarily took his walks by the stream, would notice Ninlil and wish to, quote, "forthwith embrace you, kiss you," end quote. In spite of the manner in which the two fell for each other, Ninlil was held in the highest esteem once she was given by Enlil, quote, "the garment of ladyship," end quote. With one exception, which, we believe, had to do with the dynastic succession, Enlil is never known to have had other indiscretions. A votive tablet found at Nippur shows Enlil and Ninlil being served food and beverage at their temple. The tablet was commissioned by Enlil, the, quote, "domestic of Enlil," end quote. Apart from being chief of the gods, Enlil was also deemed the supreme lord of Sumer, sometimes simply called, quote, "the land," end quote, and its, quote, "black-headed people," end quote. A Sumerian psalm spoke in veneration of this god. "Lord who knows the destiny of the land, trustworthy in his calling. Enlil who knows the destiny of Sumer, trustworthy in his calling. Father Enlil, Lord of all the lands. Father Enlil, Lord of the rightful command. Father Enlil, Shepherd of the black-headed ones. From the mountain of sunrise to the mountain of sunset, there is no other Lord in the land. You alone are king." The Sumerians revered Enlil out of both fear and gratitude. It was he who made sure that decrees by the assembly of the gods were carried out against mankind. It was his, quote, "wind," end quote, that blew obliterating storms against the offending cities. It was he who, at the time of the deluge, sought the destruction of mankind. But when at peace with mankind, he was a friendly god who bestowed favors. According to the Sumerian text, the knowledge of farming, together with the plow and the pickaxe, were granted to mankind by Enlil. Enlil also selected the kings who were to rule over mankind, not as sovereigns, but as servants of the gods entrusted with the administration of divine laws of justice. Accordingly, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian kings opened their inscriptions of self-adoration by describing how Enlil had called them to kingship. These, quote, "calls," end quote, issued by Enlil on behalf of himself and his father Anu, granted legitimacy to the ruler and outlined his functions. Even Hammurabi, who acknowledged a god named Marduk as the national god of Babylon, prefaced his code of laws by stating that, quote, "Anu and Enlil named me to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land," end quote. God of heaven and earth, firstborn of Anu, dispenser of kingship, chief executive of the assembly of the gods, father of the gods and men, grantor of agriculture, lord of the airspace. These were some of the attributes of Enlil that bespoke his greatness and powers. His, quote, command was far-reaching, end quote. His, quote, pronouncements unchangeable, end quote. He, quote, decreed the destinies, end quote. He possessed the, quote, bond heaven earth, end quote. And from his, quote, awesome city Nibiru, end quote, he could, quote, raise the beams that search the heart of all the lands, end quote. Quote, eyes that could scan all the lands, end quote. Yet he was as human as any young man enticed by a naked beauty, subject to moral laws imposed by community of the gods, transgressions of which were punishable by banishment, and not even immune to mortal complaints. At least in one instance, a Sumerian king of complained directly to the assembly of the gods that a series of troubles that had befallen and her people could be traced back to the ill-fated fact that, quote, Enlil did give the kingship to a worthless man, who is not of Sumerian seed, end quote. As we go along, we shall see the central role that Enlil played in the divine and mortal affairs on earth, and how his several sons battled among themselves and with others for the divine succession, undoubtedly giving rise to the later tales of the battles of the gods. The third great god of Sumer was another son of Anu. He bore two names, Ea and Enki. Like his brother Enlil, he too was a god of heaven and earth, a deity originally of the heavens who had come down to earth. His arrival on earth is associated in Sumerian text with a time when the waters of the Persian Gulf reached inland much farther than nowadays, turning the southern part of the country into a marshlands. Ea, the name meant literally, quote, house water, end quote, who was a master engineer, planned and supervised the construction of canals, the diking of the rivers, and the draining of the marshlands. He loved to go sailing on these waterways, and especially in the marshlands. The waters, as his name denoted, were indeed his home. He built his, quote, great house, end quote, in the city he had founded at the edge of the marshlands, a city appropriately named Haiki, quote, place of the water fishes, end quote. It was also known as Eridu, quote, home of the going afar, end quote. Ea was, quote, lord of the salt waters, end quote, the seas and oceans. Sumerian texts speak repeatedly of a very early time when the three great gods divided the realms among them. Quote, the seas they had been given to Enki, the prince of earth, end quote, thereby giving Enki, quote, the rulership of the Apsu, end quote, or the, quote, deep, end quote. As lord of the seas, Ea built ships that sailed to far lands, and especially to places from which precious metals and semi-precious stones were brought to Sumer. The earliest Sumerian cylinder sails depicted Ea as a deity surrounded by flowing streams that were sometimes shown to contain fish. The seals associated with Ea, also shown here, with the moon, indicated by its crescent, an association stemming perhaps from the fact that the moon caused the tides of the seas. It was no doubt in reference to such an astral image that Ea was given the epithet Nin-igiku, quote, Lord Bright Eye, end quote. According to the Sumerian text, including a truly amazing autobiography by Ea himself, he was born in the heavens and came down to earth before there were any settlement or civilization upon earth. Quote, when I approached the land, there was much flooding, end quote, he stated. He then proceeded to describe the series of actions taken by him to make the land habitable. He filled the Tigris River with fresh, quote, life-giving waters, end quote. He appointed a god to supervise the construction of canals to make the Tigris and Euphrates navigable, filling them up with fish and making them a haven for birds of all kinds, and causing to grow there reeds that were a useful building material. Turning from the seas and rivers to the dry land, Ea claimed that it was he who, quote, directed the plow and the yoke, opened the holy furrows, built the stalls, erected sheepfolds, end quote. Continuing, the self-adulatory text, named by scholars, quote, Enki and the World Order, end quote, credited the god with bringing to earth the arts of brickmaking, construction of dwellings and cities, metallurgy, and so on. Presenting the deity as mankind's greatest benefactor, the god who brought about civilization, many texts also depicted him as mankind's chief protagonist at the councils of the gods. Sumerian and Akkadian deluge texts, on which the biblical account must have been drawn, depict Ea as the god who, in defiance of the decision of the assembly of the gods, enabled a trusted follower, the Mesopotamian, quote, Noah, end quote, to escape the disaster. Indeed, the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, which, like the Old Testament, adhered to a belief that a god or the gods created man through a conscious and deliberate act, attribute to Ea a key role. As the chief scientist of the gods, he outlined the method and the process by which man was to be created. With such affinity to the, quote, creation, end quote, or emergence of man, no wonder that it was Ea who guided Adapa, the, quote, model man, end quote, created by Ea's, quote, wisdom, end quote, to the abode of Anu in the heavens, in defiance of the god's determination to withhold, quote, eternal life, end quote, from mankind. Was Ea on the side of man simply because he had a hand in his creation, or did he have other, more subjective motives? As we scan the record, we find that invariably Ea's defiance, in mortal and divine matters alike, was aimed mostly at frustrating decisions or plans emanating from Enlil. The record is replete with indications of Ea's burning jealousy of his brother Enlil. Indeed, Ea's other, or perhaps first, name was Enki, quote, Lord of Earth, end quote, and the texts dealing with the division of the world among the three gods hint that it may have been simply by a drawing of lots that Ea lost the mastery of Earth to his brother Enlil. The gods had clasped hands together, had cast lots and had divided. Anu then went up to heaven. To Enlil the earth was made subject. The seas, enclosed as with a loop, they had given to Enki, the prince of earth. As bitter as Ea, or Enki, may have been about the results of this drawing, he appears to have nurtured a much deeper resentment. The reason is given by Enki himself in his autobiography. It was he, not Enlil, who was firstborn, Enki claimed. It was then he, and not Enlil, who was entitled to be the heir apparent to Anu. Quote, My father, the king of the universe, brought me forth in the universe. I am the fecund seed, engineered by the great wild bull. I am the firstborn son of Anu. I am the great brother of the gods. I am he who has been born as the first son of the divine Anu. End quote. Since the codes of laws by which men lived in the ancient Near East were given by the gods, it stands to reason that the social and family laws applying to men were copies of those applying to the gods. Court and family records found at such sites as Mari and Nuzi have confirmed that the biblical customs and laws by which the Hebrew patriarchs lived were the laws by which kings and noblemen were bound throughout the ancient Near East. The succession problems the patriarchs faced are therefore instructive. Abraham, deprived of a child by the apparent barrenness of his wife Sarah, had a firstborn son by her maidservant. Yet this son, Ishmael, was excluded from the patriarchal succession as soon as Sarah herself bore Abraham a son, Isaac. Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was pregnant with twins. The one who was technically firstborn was Esau, a reddish, hairy, and rugged fellow. Holding on to Esau's heel was the more refined Jacob, whom Rebekah cherished. When the aging and half-blind Isaac was about to proclaim his testament, Rebekah used a ruse to have the blessing of succession bestowed on Jacob rather than on Esau. Finally, Jacob's succession problems resulted from the fact that though he served Laban for 20 years to get the hand of Rachel in marriage, Laban forced him to marry her older sister, Leah, first. It was Leah who bore Jacob his first son, Reuben, and he had more sons and a daughter by her and by 2 concubines. Yet when Rachel finally bore him her firstborn son, Joseph, Jacob preferred him over his brothers. Against the background of such customs and succession laws, one can understand the conflicting claims between Enlil and Ea, or Enki. Enlil, by all records the son of Anu and his official consort Antu, was the legal firstborn. But the anguished cry of Enki, quote, "I am the fecund seed, I am the firstborn son of Anu," end quote, must have been a statement of fact. Was he then born to Anu, but by another goddess who was only a concubine? The tale of Isaac and Ishmael, or the story of the twins Esau and Jacob, may have had a prior parallel in the heavenly abode. Though Enki appears to have accepted Enlil's succession prerogatives, some scholars see enough evidence to show a continuing power struggle between the two gods. Samuel N. Kramer has titled one of the ancient texts, quote, "Enki and his inferiority complex," end quote. As we shall see later on, several biblical tales of Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden, or the tale of the deluge, involve in their original Sumerian versions instances of defiance by Enki of his brother's edicts. At some point, it seems, Enki decided that there was no sense to his struggle for the divine throne, and he put his efforts into making a son of his, rather than a son of Enlil, the third-generation successor. This he sought to achieve, at least at first, with the aid of his sister, Ninhursag, quote, "Lady of the Mountainhead," end quote. She, too, was a daughter of Anu, but evidently not by Antu, and therein lay another rule of succession. Scholars have wondered in years past why both Abraham and Isaac advertised the fact that their prospective wives were also their sisters, a puzzling claim in the view of the biblical prohibition against sexual relations with the sister. But as the legal documents were unearthed at Mari and Nuzi, it became clear that a man could marry a half-sister. Moreover, when all the children of all the wives were considered, the son born of such a wife, being 50% more of the, quote, "pure seed," end quote, than a son by an unrelated wife, was the legal heir whether or not he be the firstborn son. This incidentally led, in Mari and Nuzi, to the practice of adopting the preferred wife as a, quote, "sister," end quote, in order to make her son the unchallenged legal heir. It was of such a half-sister, Ninhursag, that Enki sought to have a son. She too was, quote, "of the heavens," end quote, having come to earth in earliest times. Several texts state that when the gods were dividing Earth's domains among themselves, she was given the land of Dilmun, quote, "a pure place, a pure land, a place most bright," end quote. A text named by the scholars, quote, "Enki and Ninhursag, a paradise myth," end quote, deals with Enki's trip to Dilmun for conjugal purposes. Ninhursag, the text repeatedly stresses, quote, "was alone," end quote, unattached, a spinster. Though in later times she was depicted as an old matron, she must have been very attractive when she was younger, for the text informs us unabashedly that when Enki neared her, the sight of her, quote, "caused his penis to water the dikes," end quote. Instructing that they be left alone, Enki, quote, "poured the semen in the womb of Ninhursag. She took the semen into the womb, the semen of Enki," end quote. And then, quote, "after the 9 months of womanhood, she gave birth at the bank of the waters," end quote. But the child was a daughter. Having failed to obtain a male heir, Enki then proceeded to make love to his own daughter. Quote, "He embraced her, he kissed her. Enki poured the semen into the womb," end quote. But she, too, bore him a daughter. Enki then went after his granddaughter and made her pregnant, too. But once again, the offspring was a female. Determined to stop these efforts, Ninhursag put a curse on him whereby Enki, having eaten some plants, became mortally sick. The other gods, however, forced Ninhursag to remove the curse. While these events had great bearing on divine affairs, other tales pertaining to Enki and Ninhursag have great bearing on human affairs. For, according to the Sumerian texts, man was created by Ninhursag following processes and formulas devised by Enki. She was the chief nurse, the one in charge of medical facilities. It was in that role that the goddess was called Ninti, or, quote, "lady life," end quote. Some scholars read an Adapa, or the, quote, "model man," end quote, of Enki, the biblical Adama, or Adam. The double meaning of the Sumerian T also raises biblical parallels, for T could mean both, quote, life, end quote, and, quote, rib, end quote, so that Ninti's name meant both, quote, lady of life, end quote, and, quote, lady of the rib, end quote. The biblical Eve, whose name meant, quote, life, end quote, was created out of Adam's rib, so Eve too was, in a way, a, quote, lady of life, end quote, and a, quote, lady of the rib, end quote. As giver of life to gods and man alike, Ninhursag was spoken of as the mother goddess. She was nicknamed, quote, Mamu, end quote, the forerunner of our, quote, mom, end quote, or, quote, mama, end quote, and her symbol was the, quote, cutter, end quote, the tool used in antiquity by midwives to cut the umbilical cord after birth. Enlil, Enki's brother and rival, did have the good fortune to achieve such a, quote, rightful heir, end quote, by his sister Ninhursag. The youngest of the gods upon earth who were born in the heavens, his name was Ninurta, or, quote, Lord who completes the foundation, end quote. He was, quote, the heroic son of Enlil who went forth with net and rays of light, end quote, to battle for his father. Quote, the avenging son, who launched bolts of light, end quote. His spouse, Bau, was also a nurse or a doctor. Her epithet was, quote, lady who the dead brings back to life, end quote. The ancient portraits of Ninurta showed him holding a unique weapon, no doubt the very one that could shoot, quote, bolts of light, end quote. The ancient text hailed him as a mighty hunter, a fighting god renowned for his martial abilities. But his greatest heroic fight was not in behalf of his father or for his own sake. It was a wide-ranging battle with an evil god named Zu, or, quote, wise, end quote, and it involved no less a prize in the leadership of the gods on earth, for Zu had illegally captured the insignia and objects Enlil had held as chief of the gods. The texts describing these events are broken at the beginning, and the story becomes legible only at the point when Zu arrives at the Ikur, the temple of Enlil. He is apparently known, and of some rank, for Enlil welcomes him, quote, entrusting to him the guarding of the entrance to his shrine, end quote. But the, quote, evil Zu, end quote, was to repay trust with betrayal, for it was, quote, the removal of the Enlilship, end quote, the seizing of the divine powers that, quote, he conceived in his heart, end quote. To do so, Zu had to take possession of certain objects, including the magical Tablet of Destinies. The wily Zu seized his opportunity when Enlil undressed and went into the pool for his daily swim, leaving his paraphernalia unattended. At the entrance of the sanctuary, which he had been viewing, Zu awaits the start of day. As Enlil was washing with pure water, his crown having been removed and deposited on the throne, Zu seized the Tablet of Destinies in his hands, took away the Enlilship. As Zu fled in his Mu, translated, quote, name, end quote, but indicating a flying machine, to a faraway hideaway, the consequences of his bold act were beginning to take effect. Suspended were the divine formulas. Stillness spread all over. Silence prevailed. The sanctuary's brilliance was taken off. Quote, Father Enlil was speechless, end quote. Quote, the gods of the land gathered one by one at the news, end quote. The matter was so grave that even Anu was informed at his heavenly abode. He reviewed the situation and concluded that Zu must be apprehended so that the, quote, formulas, end quote, could be restored. Turning, quote, to the gods, his children, end quote, Anu asked, quote, which of the gods will smite Zu? His name shall be the greatest of all, end quote. Several gods known for their valor were called in, but they all pointed out, having taken the Tablet of Destinies, Zu now possesses the same powers as Enlil, so that, quote, he who opposes him becomes like clay, end quote. At this point, Ea had a great idea. Why not call upon Ninurta to take up this hopeless fight? The assembled gods could not have missed Ea's ingenious mischief. Clearly, the chances of succession falling to his own offspring stood to increase if Zu were defeated. Likewise, he could benefit if Ninurta were killed in the process. To the amazement of the gods, Ninhursag, in this text called Ninmah, quote, great lady, end quote, agreed. Turning to her son Ninurta, she explained to him that Zu robbed not only Enlil but Ninurta too of the Enlilship. Quote, with shrieks of pain I gave birth, end quote, she shouted, and it was she who, quote, made certain for my brother and for Anu, end quote, the continued, quote, kingship of heaven, end quote. So that her pains not be in vain, she instructed Ninurta to go out and fight to win. Launch thy offensive. Capture the fugitive Zu. Let thy terrifying offensive rage against him. Slit his throat. Vanquish Zu. Let thy 7 ill winds go against him. Cause the entire whirlwind to attack him. Let thy radiance go against him. Let thy winds carry his wings to a secret place. Let sovereignty return to occur. Let the divine formulas return to the Father who begot thee. The various versions of the epic then provided thrilling descriptions of the battle that ensued. Ninurta shot, quote, arrows, end quote, at Zu, but, quote, the arrows could not approach Zu's body, while he bore the tablet of destinies of the gods in his hand, end quote. The launched, quote, weapons were stopped in the midst, end quote, of their flight. As the inconclusive battle wore on, Ea advised Ninurta to add a tilum to his weapons, and shoot it into the, quote, pinions, end quote, or small cogwheels of Zu's, quote, wings, end quote. Following this advice, and shouting, quote, wing to wing, end quote, Ninurta shot the tilum at Zu's pinions. Thus hit, the pinions began to scatter, and the, quote, wings, end quote, of Zu fell in a swirl. Zu was vanquished, and the tablets of destiny returned to Enlil. Who was Zu? Was he, as some scholars hold, a, quote, mythological bird, end quote? Evidently he could fly, but so can any man today who takes a plane, or any astronaut who goes up in a spaceship. Ninurta, too, could fly, as skillfully as Zu, and perhaps better. But he himself was not a bird of any kind, as his many depictions, by himself or with his consort Bau, also called Gula, make abundantly clear. Rather, he did his flying with the aid of a remarkable, quote, bird, end quote, which was kept at his sacred precinct, the Gursu, in the city of Lagash. Nor was Zu a, quote, bird, end quote. Apparently he had at his disposal a, quote, bird, end quote, in which he could fly away into hiding. It was from within such, quote, birds, end quote, that the sky battle took place between the two gods. And there can be no doubt regarding the nature of the weapon that finally smote Zu's, quote, bird, end quote. Called Til in Sumerian and Tilum in Assyrian, it was written pictorially thus, as an arrow shape, and it must have meant then what Til means nowadays in Hebrew, quote, missile, end quote. Zu, then, was a god, one of the gods who had reason to scheme at usurpation of the Enlilship, a god whom Ninurta, as the legitimate successor, had every reason to fight. Was he perhaps Marduk, quote, son of the Pure Mound, end quote, Enki's firstborn by his wife Damkina, impatient to seize by a ruse what was not legally his? There is reason to believe that, having failed to achieve a son by his sister and thus produced a legal contender for the Enlilship, Enki relied on his son Marduk. Indeed, when the ancient Near East was seized with great social and military upheavals at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, Marduk was elevated in Babylon to the status of national god of Sumer and Akkad. Marduk was proclaimed king of the gods, replacing Enlil, and the other gods were required to pledge allegiance to him and come to reside in Babylon, where their activities could easily be supervised. This usurpation of the Enlilship, long after the incident with Zu, was accompanied by an extensive Babylonian effort to forge the ancient text. The most important texts were rewritten and altered so as to make Marduk appear as the Lord of Heavens, the Creator, the Benefactor, the Hero, instead of Anu or Enlil or even Ninurta. Among the texts altered was the, quote, tale of Zu, end quote, and according to the Babylonian version, it was Marduk, not Ninurta, who fought Zu. In this version, Marduk boasted, quote, Mahasti mo ilzu, end quote, or, quote, I have crushed the skull of the god Zu, end quote. Clearly, then, Zu could not have been Marduk. Nor would it stand to reason that Enki, quote, god of sciences, end quote, would have coached Ninurta regarding the choice and use of the successful weapons against his own son Marduk. Enki, to judge by his behavior as well as by his urging Ninurta to, quote, cut the throat of Zu, end quote, expected to gain from the fight no matter who lost. The only logical conclusion is that Zu, too, was in some way a legal contender to the Enlilship. This leaves only one god, Nana, the firstborn of Enlil by his official consort, Ninlil. For if Ninurta was eliminated, Nana would be in the unobstructed line of succession. Nana, short for Nanar, or, quote, bright one, end quote, has come down to us through the ages better known by his Akkadian, or, quote, Semitic, end quote, name Sin. As firstborn of Enlil, he was granted sovereignty over Sumer's best-known city-state, quote, the city, end quote. His temple there was called Yigishi Nugal, or, quote, house of the seed of the throne, end quote. From that abode, Nana and his consort Ningal, quote, great lady, end quote, conducted the affairs of the city and its people with great benevolence. The people of reciprocated with great affection for their divine rulers, lovingly calling their god, quote, Father Nana, end quote, and other affectionate nicknames. The prosperity of was attributed by its people directly to Nana. Shilgi, a ruler of by the god's grace, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, described the, quote, house, end quote, of Nana as, quote, a great stall filled with abundance, end quote, a, quote, bountiful place of bread offerings, end quote, where sheep multiplied and oxen were slaughtered, a place of sweet music where the drum and timbrel sounded. Under the administration of its god-protector Nana, became the granary of Sumer, the supplier of grains as well as of sheep and cattle to other temples elsewhere. A, quote, lamentation over the destruction of end quote, informs us, in a negative way, of what was like before its demise. In the granaries of Nana there was no grain. The evening meals of the gods were suppressed. In their great dining halls, wine and honey ended. In his temple's lofty oven, oxen and sheep are not prepared. The hum has ceased at Nana's great place of shackles. The house where commands for the ox were shouted, its silence overwhelming. Its grinding mortar and pestle lie inert. The offering boats carried no offerings, did not bring offering bread to Enlil and the poor. River is empty, no barge moves on it. No foot trods its banks, long grasses grow there. Another lamentation, bewailing the, quote, sheepfolds that have been delivered to the wind, end quote, the abandoned stables, the shepherds and herdsmen that were gone, is most unusual. It was not written by the people of but by the god Nana and his spouse Ningal themselves. These and other lamentations over the fall of disclose the trauma of some unusual event. The Sumerian texts inform us that Nana and Ningal left the city before its demise became complete. It was a hasty departure, touchingly described. Nana, who loved his city, departed from the city. Sin, who loved no longer stayed in his house. Ningal, fleeing her city through enemy territory, hastily put on a garment, departed from her house. The fall of and the exile of its gods have been depicted in the Lamentations as a result of a deliberate decision by Anu and Enlil. It was the two of them that Nana appealed to call off the punishment. May Anu, the king of the gods, utter, quote, it is enough, end quote. May Enlil, the king of the lands, decree a favorable fate. Appealing directly to Enlil, quote, Sin brought his suffering heart to his father, curtsied before Enlil, the father who begot him, end quote, and begged him. O my Father who begot me, until when will you look inimically upon my atonement? Until when? On the oppressed heart that you have made flicker like a flame, please cast a friendly eye. Nowhere do the Lamentations disclose the cause of Anu's and Enlil's wrath, but if Nana were Zu, the punishment would have justified his crime of usurpation. Was he Zu? He certainly could have been Zu, because Zu was in possession of some kind of flying machine, the quote, bird, end quote, in which he escaped and from which he fought Ninurta. Sumerian psalms spoke in adoration of his, quote, boat of heaven, end quote. Father Nanar, Lord of whose glory in the sacred boat of heaven is, Lord, firstborn son of Enlil, when in the boat of heaven thou ascendest, thou art glorious. Enlil hath adorned thy hand with a scepter everlasting, when over in the sacred boat thou mountest. Before the discovery of the new fragments of the tale of Zu, it was assumed that because Nana's other name, Sin, derived from Suin, which was similar to Zuin, the two were identical. But now we know that Zu's full name was Anzu, yet another contender for the Enlilship. Whatever the role of Nana/Sin in those events, he was removed from direct contention for the Enlilship. Both Sumerian texts as well as archaeological evidence indicate that Sin and his spouse fled to Haran, the Hurrian city protected by several rivers and mountainous terrain. It is noteworthy that when Abraham's clan, led by his father Terah, left they also set their course to Haran, where they stayed for many years en route to the Promised Land. Though remained for all time a city dedicated to Nana/Sin, Haran must have been his residence for a very long time, for it was made to resemble its temples, buildings, and streets almost exactly. André Perrat, of Abraham et Son Temps, sums up the similarities by saying that, quote, there is every evidence that the cult of Haran was nothing but an exact replica of that of end quote. When the Temple of Sin at Haran, built and rebuilt over the millennia, was uncovered during excavations that lasted more than 50 years, the finds included 2 stelae, or memorial stone pillars, on which a unique record was inscribed. It was a record dictated by Adad Gopi, a high priestess of Sin, of how she prayed and planned for the return of Sin at some unknown prior time. Sin, the king of all the gods, became angry with his city and his temple, and went up to heaven. That Sin, disgusted or despairing, just, quote, packed up, end quote, and, quote, went up to heaven, end quote, is corroborated by other inscriptions. These tell us that the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal retrieved from certain enemies a sacred, quote, cylinder seal of the costliest jasper, end quote, and, quote, had it improved by drawing upon it a picture of Sin, end quote. He further inscribed upon the sacred stone, quote, a eulogy of Sin, and hung it around the neck of the image of Sin, end quote. That stone seal of Sin must have been a relic of olden times, for it is further stated that, quote, it is the one whose face had been damaged in those days, during the destruction wrought by the enemy, end quote. The high priestess, who was born during the reign of Ashurbanipal, is assumed to have been royal blood herself. In her appeals to Sin, she proposed a practical, quote, deal, end quote, the restoration of his powers over his advisories in return for helping her son Nabunad become ruler of Sumer and Akkad. Historical records confirm that in the year 555 BC, Nabunad, then commander of the Babylonian armies, was named by his fellow officers to the throne. In this, he was stated to have been directly helped by Sin. It was, the inscriptions by Nabunad inform us, quote, on the first day of his appearance, end quote, that Sin, using, quote, the weapon of Anu, end quote, was able to, quote, touch with a beam of light, end quote, the skies and crush the enemies down on earth below. Nabunad kept his mother's promise to the god. He rebuilt Sin's temple, Ihulu, quote, house of great joy, end quote, and declared Sin to be supreme god. It was then that Sin was able to grasp in his hands, quote, the power of the Anu office, wield all the power of the Enlil office, take over the power of the Ea office, holding thus in his hand all the heavenly powers, end quote. Thus defeating the usurper Marduk, even capturing the powers of Marduk's father Ea, Sin assumed the title of, quote, divine crescent, end quote, and established his reputation as the so-called moon god. How could Sin, reported to have gone back to heaven in disgust, have been able to perform such feats back on earth? Nagunad, confirming that Sin had indeed, quote, forgotten his angry command and decided to return to the temple Ihulhul, end quote, claimed a miracle, quote, that has not happened to the land since the days of old, end quote, had taken place. A deity, quote, has come down from heaven, end quote. This is the great miracle of Sin, that has not happened to the land since the days of old, that the people of the land have not seen nor had written on clay tablets to preserve forever. That Sin, Lord of all the gods and goddesses, residing in heaven, has come down from heaven. Regrettably, no details are provided of the place and manner in which Sin landed back on earth, but we do know that it was in the fields outside of Haran that Jacob, on his way from Canaan to find himself a bride in the, quote, old country, end quote, saw, quote, a ladder set up on the earth and its top reaching heavenward, and there were angels of the Lord ascending and descending by it, end quote. At the same time that Nanabad restored the powers in the temples of Nana/Sin, he also restored the temples and worship of Sin's twin children, Inanna, quote, Anu's lady, end quote, and Utu, quote, the shining one, end quote. The two were born to Sin by his official spouse Ningal, and were thus by birth members of a divine dynasty. Inanna was technically the firstborn, but her twin brother, Utu, was the firstborn son, and thus the legal dynastic heir. Unlike the rivalry that existed in the similar instances of Esau and Jacob, the two divine children grew up very close to each other. They shared experiences and adventures, came to each other's aid, and when Inanna had to choose a husband from one of two gods, she turned to her brother for advice. Inanna and Utu were born in the time immemorial, when only the gods inhabited earth. Utu's city domain, Sippar, was listed among the very first cities to have been established by the gods in Sumer. Nagunad stated in an inscription that when he undertook to rebuild Utu's temple, the Babara, quote, shining house, end quote, in Sippar, I sought out its ancient foundation platform, and I went down 18 cubits into the soil. Utu, the great lord of Ibabara, showed me personally the foundation platform. Of Naram Sin, son of Sargon, which for 3,200 years no king preceded me had seen. When civilization blossomed in Sumer, a man joined the gods in the land between the rivers. Utu became associated primarily with law and justice. Several earlier law codes, apart from invoking Anu and Enlil, were also presented as requiring acceptance and adherence because they were promulgated, quote, in accordance with the true word of Utu, end quote. The Babylonian king Hammurabi inscribed his law code on a stela, at the top of which the king is depicted receiving the laws from the god. Tablets uncovered at Sippar attest to its reputation in ancient times as a place of just and fair laws. Some texts depict Utu himself as sitting in judgment on gods and men alike. Sippar was, in fact, the seat of Sumer's, quote, supreme court, end quote. The justice advocated by Utu is reminiscent of the Sermon on the Mount recorded in the New Testament. A, quote, wisdom tablet, end quote, suggested the following behavior to please Utu. Unto your opponent do no evil. Your evildoer recompense with good. Unto your enemy let justice be done. Let not your heart be induced to do evil. to the one begging for alms, give food to eat, give wine to drink. Be helpful, do good. Because he assured justice and prevented oppression, and perhaps for other reasons too, as we shall see later on, Utu was considered the protector of travelers. Yet the most common and lasting epithets applied to Utu concerned his brilliance. From earliest times, he was called Babar, quote, shining one, end quote. He was, quote, Utu, who sheds a wide light, end quote, the one who, quote, lights up heaven and earth, end quote. Hammurabi, and his inscription, called the god by his Akkadian name, Shamash, which in Semitic languages means, quote, sun, end quote. It has therefore been assumed by the scholars that Utu/Shamash was the Mesopotamian sun god. We shall show, as we proceed, that while this god was assigned the sun as his celestial counterpart, there was another aspect to the statement that he, quote, shed a bright light, end quote, when he performed the special task assigned to him by his grandfather Enlil. Just as the law codes and the court records are human testimonials to the actual presence among the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia of a deity named Utu/Shamash, so there exist endless inscriptions, texts, incantations, oracles, prayers, and depictions attesting to the physical presence and existence of the goddess Inanna, whose Akkadian name was Ishtar. A Mesopotamian king in the 13th century BC stated that he rebuilt her temple in her brother's city of Sippar on foundations that were 800 years old in his time. But in her central city, Uruk, tales of her went back to olden times. Known to the Romans as Venus, to the Greeks as Aphrodite, to the Canaanites and the Hebrews as Astarte, to the Assyrians and Babylonians and Hittites and the other ancient peoples as Ishtar or Eshtar, to the Akkadians and the Sumerians as Inanna or Inin or Nini, or by others of her many nicknames and epithets, she was at all times a goddess of warfare and a goddess of love, a fierce, beautiful woman who, though only a great-granddaughter of Anu, carved for herself, by herself, a major place among the great gods of heaven and earth. As a young goddess, she was, apparently, assigned a domain in a far land east of Sumer, the land of Arata. It was there that, quote, the lofty one, Inanna, queen of all the land, end quote, had her, quote, house, end quote. But Inanna had greater ambitions. In the city of Uruk there stood the great temple of Anu, occupied only during his occasional state visits to Earth, and Inanna set her eyes on this seat of power. Sumerian king lists state that the first non-divine ruler of Uruk was Meshki-Agasher, a son of the god Utu by a human mother. He was followed by his son Enmerkar, a great Sumerian king. Inanna, then, was the great aunt of Enmerkar, and she found little difficulty in persuading him that she should really be the goddess of Uruk, rather than of the remote Arata. A long and fascinating text named, quote, Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, end quote, describes how Enmerkar sent emissaries to Arata, using every possible argument in a, quote, war of nerves, end quote, to force Arata to submit because, quote, the Lord Enmerkar, who is the servant of Inanna, made her queen of the house of Anu, end quote. The epic's unclear end hints at a happy ending. While Inanna moved to Uruk, she did not, quote, abandon her house in Arata, end quote. That she might have become a, quote, commuting goddess, end quote, is not so improbable, for Inanna/Ishtar was known from other texts as an adventurous traveler. Her occupation of Anu's temple in Uruk could not have taken place without his knowledge and consent, and the texts give us strong clues as to how such consent was obtained. Soon Inanna was known as, quote, Anunnatum, end quote, a nickname meaning, quote, beloved of Anu, end quote. She was referred to in text as, quote, the holy mistress of Anu, end quote, and it follows that Inanna shared not only Anu's temple but also his bed, whenever he came to Uruk, or on the reported occasions of her going up to his heavenly abode. Having thus maneuvered herself into the position of goddess of Uruk and mistress of the temple of Anu, Ishtar proceeded to use trickery for enhancing Uruk's standing and her own powers. Farther down the Euphrates stood the ancient city of Eridu, Enki's center. Knowing of his great knowledge of all the arts and sciences of civilization, Inanna resolved to beg, borrow, or steal these secrets. Obviously intending to use her, quote, personal charms, end quote, on Enki, her great-uncle, Inanna arranged to call on him alone. That fact was not unnoticed by Enki, who instructed his housemaster to prepare dinner for two. "Come, my housemaster, Isamid, hear my instructions. A word I shall say to you, heed my words. The maiden, all alone, has directed her step to the Abzu. Have the maiden enter the Abzu of Eridu. Give her to eat barley cakes with butter. Pour for her cold water that freshens the heart. Give her to drink beer." Happy and drunk, Enki was ready to do anything for Inanna. She boldly asked for the divine formulas, which were the basis of a high civilization. Enki granted her some 100 of them, including divine formulas pertaining to supreme lordship, kingship, priestly functions, weapons, legal procedures, scribeship, woodworking, even the knowledge of musical instruments and of temple prostitution. By the time Enki awoke and realized what he had done, Inanna was already well on her way to Uruk. Enki ordered after her his, quote, awesome weapons, end quote, but to no avail, for Inanna had sped to Uruk in her, quote, boat of heaven, end quote. Quite frequently, Ishtar was depicted as a naked goddess, flaunting her beauty. She was sometimes even depicted raising her skirt to reveal the lower parts of her body. Gilgamesh, a ruler of Uruk circa 2900 BC, who was also partly divine, having been born to a human father and a goddess, reported how Inanna enticed him, even after she already had an official spouse. Having washed himself after a battle and put on, quote, a fringed cloak fashioned with a sash, end quote. Glorious Ishtar raised an eye at his beauty. Quote, "Come, Gilgamesh, be thou my lover. Come, grant me your fruit. Thou shalt be my male mate, I will be thy female," end quote. But Gilgamesh knew the score. Quote, "Which of thy lovers didst thou love forever?" end quote, he asked. Quote, "Which of thy shepherds pleased thee for all time?" end quote. Reciting a long list of her love affairs, he refused. As time went on, as she assumed higher ranks in the pantheon, and with it the responsibility for affairs of state, Inanna/Ishtar began to display more martial qualities, and was often depicted as a goddess of war, armed to the teeth. The inscriptions left by Assyrian kings describe how they went to war for her and upon her command, how she directly advised when to wait and when to attack, how she sometimes marched at the head of the armies, and how, on at least one occasion, she granted a theophany and appeared before all of the troops. In return for their loyalty, she promised the Assyrian kings long life and success. Quote, "From a golden chamber in the skies I will watch over thee," end quote, she assured them. Was she turned into a bitter warrior because she, too, came upon hard times with the rise of Marduk to supremacy? In one of his inscriptions, Nabonadd said, quote, "Inanna of Uruk, the exalted princess who dwelt in a gold cella, who rode upon a chariot to which were harnessed 7 lions, the inhabitants of Uruk changed her colt during the rule of King Erba Marduk, removed her cella and unharnessed her team," end quote. Inanna, reported Nabonadd, quote, "had therefore left the Iana angrily and stayed hence in an unseemly place," end quote, which he does not name. Seeking, perhaps, to combine love with power, the much-courted Inanna chose as her husband Dumuzi, a younger son of Enki. Many ancient texts deal with the loves and quarrels of the two. Some are love songs of great beauty and vivid sexuality. Others tell how Ishtar, back from one of her journeys, found Dumuzi celebrating her absence. She arranged for his capture and disappearance into the lower world, a domain ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal, and her consort, Nergal. Some of the most celebrated Sumerian and Akkadian texts deal with the journey of Ishtar to the lower world in search of her banished beloved. Of the 6 known sons of Enki, 3 have been featured in Sumerian tales. The firstborn Marduk, who eventually usurped the supremacy, Nergal, who became the ruler of the lower world, and Dumuzi, who married Inanna/Ishtar. Enlil too had 3 sons who played key roles in both divine and human affairs. Ninurta, who having been born to Enlil by his sister Ninhursag, was the legal successor. Nana/Sin, firstborn by Enlil's official spouse Ninlil, and a younger son by Ninlil named Ishkur, quote, mountainous, end quote, or, quote, far mountain land, end quote, who was more frequently called Adad, quote, beloved, end quote. As brother of Sin and uncle of Utu and Inanna, Adad appears to have felt more at home with them than at his own house. The Sumerian texts constantly grouped the 4 together. The ceremonies connected with the visit of Anu to Uruk also spoke of the 4 as a group. One text, describing the entrance to the court of Anu, states that the throne room was reached through, quote, the gate of Sin, Shamash, Adad, and Ishtar, end quote. Another text, first published by V.K. Shaleko of Russian Academy of the History of Material Cultures, poetically described the 4 as retiring for the night together. The greatest affinity seems to have existed between Adad and Ishtar, and the 2 are even depicted next to each other, as on this relief showing an Assyrian ruler being blessed by Adad, holding the ring and lightning, and by Ishtar holding her bow. The 3rd deity is too mutilated to be identified. Was there more to this, quote, affinity, end quote, than a platonic relationship, especially in view of Ishtar's, quote, record, end quote? It is noteworthy that in the biblical Song of Songs, the playful girl calls her lover Dad, a word that means both, quote, lover, end quote, and, quote, uncle, end quote. Now, was Ishkar called Adad, a derivative from the Sumerian Dada, because he was the uncle who was the lover? But Ishkur was not only a playboy, he was a mighty god, endowed by his father Enlil with the powers and prerogatives of a storm god. As such, he was revered as the Hurrian/Hittite Teshub and the Urartian Teshubu, quote, windblower, end quote. The Amorite Ramanu, quote, thunderer, end quote. The Canaanite Regimu, quote, caster of hailstones, end quote. The Indo-European Barayash, quote, light maker, end quote. The Semitic Mir, quote, he who lights up, end quote, the skies. A god list kept at the British Museum, as shown by Hans Schlobies of Der Akkadisch Wettergat and Mesopotamian, clarifies that Ishkur was indeed the divine lord in the lands far from Sumer and Akkad. As Sumerian texts reveal, this was no accident. Enlil, it seems, willfully dispatched his young son to become the, quote, resident deity, end quote, in the mountain lands north and west of Mesopotamia. Why did Enlil dispatch his youngest and beloved son from Nippur? Several Sumerian epic tales have been found about the arguments and even bloody struggles among the younger gods. Many cylinder seals depict scenes of god battling god. It would seem that the original rivalry between Enki and Enlil was carried on and intensified between their sons, with brother sometimes turning against brother, a divine tale of Cain and Abel. Some of these battles were against a deity identified as Kur, in all probability Ishkur/Adad. This may well explain why Enlil deemed it advisable to grant his younger son a far-off domain, to keep him out of the dangerous battles for the succession. The position of the sons of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, and of their offspring, in the dynastic lineage emerges clearly through a unique Sumerian device, the allocation of numerical rank to certain gods. The discovery of this system also brings out the membership in the great circle of gods of heaven and earth when Sumerian civilization blossomed. we shall find that this supreme pantheon was made up of 12 deities. The first hint that a cryptographic number system was applied to the great gods came with the discovery that the names of the gods Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar were sometimes substituted in the text by the numbers 30, 20, and 15, respectively. The highest unit of the Sumerian sexagesimal system, 60, was assigned to Anu. Enlil, quote, was, end quote, 50, Enki, 40, and Adad, 10. The number 10 and its multiple within the prime number 60 were thus assigned to male deities, and it would appear plausible that the numbers ending with 5 were assigned to the female deities. From this, the following cryptographic table emerges. For males, 60 for Anu, 50 for Enlil, 40 for Ea/Enki, 30 for Nana/Sin, 20 for Utu/Shamash, and 10 for Ishkur/Adad. For female, 55 for Antu, 45 for Nenlil, 35 for Ninki, 25 for Nengal, 15 for Inanna/Ishtar, and 5 for Ninhursag. Ninurta, we should not be surprised to learn, was assigned the number 50 like his father. In other words, his dynastic rank was conveyed in a cryptographic message. If Enlil goes, you, Ninurta, step up into his shoes. Until then, you are not one of the 12, for the rank of 50 is occupied. Nor should we be surprised to learn that when Marduk usurped the Enlilship, he insisted that the gods bestow on him, quote, the 50 names, end quote, to signify that the rank of, quote, 50, end quote, had become his. There were many other gods in Sumer, children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews of the great gods. There were also several hundred rank and file gods, called Anunnaki, who were assigned, one may say, quote, general duties, end quote. But only 12 made the great circle. They, their family relationships, and, above all, the line of dynastic succession can be better referred to if we show them in a chart.
End of Chapter 4. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe for more. Also, please comment sequel below if you want to hear Book 2 of the Earth Chronicles series, The Stairway to Heaven.